A flight attendant told a black teen to move to the back, but then his father stood up from row 1, and the entire cabin went silent. He told the black teen to move to the back, thinking no one would challenge him. He didn't realize the father in row 1 had already decided this act wouldn't go unanswered. Subscribe if you believe disrespect always meets instant accountability. Hey! The voice barked, stopping Xavier mid-step just as the aircraft door clicked shut behind him. Back rows where we're keeping open seats for extra balance. You'll need to shift to 28E. Xavier Kellis froze at the entrance of the cabin, the recycled air suddenly feeling too tight in his lungs. The flight attendant blocking the aisle was tall, with sharp shoulders and a navy vest pulled taut over a crisp white shirt. His name badge read Darren Mav. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. Just held a clipboard tight in his left hand and gestured with a stiff motion down the aisle.
I'm sorry,
Xavier said, trying to keep his voice even. He raised his boarding pass like a shield. I'm seat 12A. Darren didn't look at the paper. You'll be more comfortable in the back anyway, he said, already stepping aside as if the matter was settled. The edge in his voice wasn't loud, but it was there, like gravel under silk. Xavier blinked again, his grip tightening around the strap of his backpack. But this says 12A, he repeated, raising the pass a little higher. His words hung in the cabin's front entrance as 2 business-class passengers turned their heads slightly. Neither said a word. Neither intervened. Darren finally looked at the paper, not to read it but to scoff. Just follow my instructions, son, he said. The word son dropped with extra weight. Xavier didn't move. The hum of the aircraft filled the silence, the distant clatter of overhead bins being closed farther down the aisle. He glanced toward row 1. His father was already seated, separated only by a few rows, but it felt like miles now. Dr. Jalen Kellis had boarded early because their tickets were split. First class for him, economy for Xavier. A last-minute booking glitch. They'd laughed about it at the gate. It was supposed to be no big deal. But now Xavier felt suddenly alone, and watched. His heartbeat quickened, but his face remained steady. He'd learned that skill from his father. Read the room, breathe deep, don't show too much. Still, he hesitated. Darren's posture grew tighter. He stepped half a foot closer. Is there a problem? He asked. Not curious, not helpful, just rigid with that same clipboard held like a barrier. Xavier looked down the aisle toward 12A. His assigned seat. It was open, waiting, empty. Is there a problem? Darren repeated, louder now, drawing a glance from a flight attendant at the far galley and a few passengers who turned and then quickly looked away. Xavier felt the weight of their silence pressing into him. He wanted to protest, wanted to call his dad, wanted to demand that someone else look at the paper in his hand. But something in Darren's eyes, something dry and rehearsed, told him that wouldn't change anything. Xavier nodded slowly. No problem, he said, and walked. Each step toward the back of the plane felt like it took something from him. Row 12 passed by on his left, clean and unoccupied. He brushed it with his hand as he passed, like touching something sacred that had just been taken. Rows 15, 22. They blurred as he walked, the murmurs of other passengers fading into the static hum in his ears. Finally, at row 28, he stopped. Middle seat. Wedged between 2 broad-shouldered men who didn't acknowledge him, didn't shift, didn't smile. One of them grunted and leaned away just far enough to let Xavier squeeze in. His knees pressed into the seat ahead. He exhaled slowly and sat. For a few seconds, he just stared forward. His phone vibrated in his jacket pocket, but he didn't check it right away. He adjusted his backpack beneath the seat. Then, with trembling fingers, unlocked his screen and opened the camera. He raised it slowly to take a selfie, proof for his dad. Something in him needed that, but he lowered it without snapping the picture. His reflection looked off. Not nervous, something else. His eyes, he realized, weren't just confused. They were questioning, disappointed, not in himself, in something bigger. He opened the messaging app instead and typed, "They moved me to the back. Not sure why. Can we ask?" The message hovered on the screen. Then, a second later, sent. He tucked the phone back into his jacket. Outside, the wing of the plane glinted in the late afternoon sun. Inside, the air felt still. No one around him said a word. No one had seen anything, at least not enough to care. Xavier glanced toward the front. From this far back, he couldn't see row 1. Couldn't see his dad. Couldn't see the flight attendant anymore either. All he could see were backs of heads and the silence between rows. He told himself it didn't matter. It's just a seat, he whispered under his breath, trying to make it true. But it didn't feel like just a seat anymore. Xavier didn't argue. He turned as instructed and began walking toward the back of the aircraft, his sneakers muffled against the carpeted aisle. Every step felt heavier than the last. He passed row after row. Some passengers glanced up. Others avoided his eyes entirely. When he reached 28E, the tension in his chest hadn't eased. The seat was wedged between two broad-shouldered men who barely acknowledged him. One wore noise-canceling headphones, the other was already asleep. Xavier tried to maneuver his backpack under the seat but had to twist his knees painfully to fit. The armrest dug into his side. He exhaled slowly and pulled out his phone, thinking he'd take a quick selfie for his dad, something to mark the moment. But as he saw his own face in the camera, surrounded by elbows and silence, he stopped. This wasn't what he imagined his first solo flight would feel like. He put the phone down and typed instead, "They moved me to the back. Not sure why. Can we ask?" The message hung in the air like a question shouted into fog. Xavier stared at the screen. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The plane's cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew moved into final preparations. He knew his father would check the message eventually, if there was a sync window. Still, he felt a growing unease, like something wrong had been done but no one had noticed. Or worse, noticed and stayed quiet. Up in row 1, Dr. Jalen Kellis sat with his tray table still folded. His phone, connected briefly as the plane prepped for departure, buzzed once. He tapped the screen and read the text. In an instant, the muscles in his face shifted. He adjusted his cufflinks, placed his tablet aside, and rose slowly. His steps down the aisle were measured, controlled, but every inch radiated intent. He wasn't walking with panic. He was walking with purpose. A few passengers looked up from their screens. A man reading a magazine paused mid-page. The hush that followed was quiet, but pointed. Near the galley at the center of the aircraft, Jalen spotted the tall figure of the same flight attendant his son had described, Darren Mav. Clipboard in hand, posture stiff, expression unreadable. Jalen approached and spoke with calm precision. "Excuse me," he said. "My son was told to move seats. Can you explain why?" Darren turned slightly, caught off guard by the formal tone. His eyes flicked down the aisle, perhaps toward where Xavier now sat, and then quickly back. His jaw tightened. "Safety balance issue," Darren muttered. "Cruise call." Jalen didn't blink. "Interesting," he replied. "Then let's review this call together." Darren shifted his stance, the clipboard now clutched a little tighter. There was something in Jalen's voice that didn't raise volume, but raised pressure, like steel under silk. Jalen didn't move closer, didn't raise his voice, but the air around him seemed to constrict. "I'd like to know," Jalen continued, "why my son, who held a confirmed boarding pass for 12A, was relocated without notification, and more importantly, why only he was moved from the front, while several rows behind remained open." Darren's gaze hardened, but Jalen had already seen too much. Years as a behavioral analyst taught him how people react when caught, small giveaways, micro-movements, the dart of the eye, the tightening of the fingers, the shallow breath. "Sir," Darren said, voice clipped, "it's protocol. We don't owe individual passengers breakdowns on every crew decision." "Correct," Jalen said smoothly, "until that decision involves unlawful profiling. Then the explanation becomes mandatory." A beat of silence. Then a younger flight attendant, nervous, early 20s, brown hair, slim build, stepped slightly into view from the side jump seat. His badge read Milo Tren. He looked between Jalen and Darren, clearly uncomfortable. Something was building now. Something no one could pretend was normal. "We need all passengers seated for final checks," Milo offered, voice unsure but trying to smooth things over. Jalen looked directly at him. His voice softened, not in weakness, but in precision. "We'll resume that once I understand why my son was reassigned despite holding a valid ticket and confirmed boarding pass," he said. "Unless you'd like to explain it to the Department of Passenger Oversight after landing." The weight of those words landed like lead. Milo's face went pale. Darren's brows twitched. And around them, the invisible wall of passenger silence began to crack. A few phones quietly angled upward. Fingers tapped record. Jalen didn't need them to speak. He just needed them to see. From the back, Xavier rose hesitantly. Jalen motioned to him. "Son, show him your original ticket." Xavier walked the aisle slowly, the eyes of strangers following him. His cheeks were hot. His throat was tight, but he held out the phone. On the screen, 12A, clear as day. Darren took one glance and scoffed. "Fine," he snapped. "He can take it. Was just a mix-up." Jalen's expression didn't flinch, but his voice went cold. "Was it?" he asked. "Because I noticed the only other person moved from the front was a Hispanic man. The rows behind are nearly empty." There it was, the moment no one could step back from. Milo checked the manifest on his tablet. His eyes darted down the list, then stopped. His brow furrowed. "Actually," he began slowly, "there's no record of a shift needed in this section, Darren." Jalen didn't look away. He took a single step forward, close enough that only Darren could hear his next words clearly. "So tell me again, why did you move him?" He paused. Then, for everyone watching, he added one final sentence, firm, quiet, unshakable. "The question," he said coldly, "is now on record. Sir, we need all passengers seated for final checks." The voice came from Milo Tren, the younger flight attendant stationed at the front jump seat, his words carrying a rehearsed edge of protocol, but his eyes darted nervously toward Darren Mav. Jalen Kellis didn't budge. He stood tall in the narrow aisle, blazer buttoned, jaw set, voice like polished stone. "We'll resume that once I understand why my son was reassigned despite holding a valid ticket and confirmed boarding pass," he said, each syllable sharpened by a quiet fire beneath his calm. "Unless you'd like to explain it to the Department of Passenger Oversight after landing." A sharp silence seized the cabin. The soft mechanical hum of air vents was suddenly all that filled the space. A few heads turned. Phones, half concealed, tilted upward, recording. Passengers weren't just watching, they were witnessing. Darren's posture faltered slightly. His clipboard hung loosely now, and the stiff mask of authority he wore began to crack at the edges. He wasn't used to passengers talking back, let alone doing so with surgical clarity. He looked from Jalen to Milo, then toward the cockpit, as if hoping the captain might intervene. But no voice came over the intercom, only the ever-growing tension pressing down like gravity. Jalen stepped aside and gestured firmly. "Son," he said, his voice both command and invitation. "Show him your original ticket." From near the back, Xavier rose. His walk up the aisle was slow, deliberate. At 16, he wasn't used to being the center of this kind of attention. He held up his phone, the screen glowing with the digital boarding pass. 12A. His cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from the heat of dozens of unseen eyes on him. When he stopped beside his father, Jalen gently placed a hand on the small of his back, anchoring him. Darren took a quick glance at the screen and scoffed. "Fine," he muttered. "He can take it. Was just a mix-up." But Jalen didn't accept the excuse. "Was it?" he asked, tilting his head. His eyes, unblinking, studied Darren the way a seasoned professor studies a questionable claim. "Because I noticed the only other person moved from the front was a Hispanic man, and I walked past at least 6 empty rows toward the back." Milo, still standing to the side, frowned. "Actually," he tapped a few buttons on his handheld device, pulling up the seat map, There's no record of a shift needed in this section, Darren. No notes. No safety reallocation logged. Darren stiffened. It's just common procedure. Sometimes we need to rebalance for trim and load distribution. Then why wasn't it documented? Jalen pressed. His tone didn't rise, but it grew heavier, the kind that demanded answers without raising a voice. Why was my son told to move without it being flagged in the system? And why, of all passengers, were the two moved the only men of color in the forward cabin? Darren's throat bobbed. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Words failed. Excuses unraveled before they could even form. The phone cameras kept rolling. Jalen stepped slightly closer, not to intimidate, but to make sure the words landed exactly where they needed to. His voice dropped to a colder register. So tell me again, why did you move him? Darren stood frozen, caught between the unraveling illusion of protocol and the rising tide of accountability. Jalen didn't blink. The question, he said coldly, is now on record. Final checks. Prepare for departure. The captain's voice cut through the cabin with professional indifference, unaware of the silent storm brewing just beyond the first-class curtain. The PA crackled off. But for the passengers now watching intently, the flight was already grounded in something deeper than protocol. Milo Tren's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the interphone and pressed the call button. His voice, hushed but steady, traveled to the gate crew. We've got a developing incident. Can you send Supervisor Marsh to the cabin? Now. The response was swift. Moments later, the cabin door hissed open again, breaking the illusion of routine. Relin Marsh stepped inside with a purposeful gait, clipboard under one arm, concern etched into the lines of his forehead. Dressed in a dark blue blazer with his ID badge clipped squarely to his lapel, he scanned the tense cabin. Dozens of eyes tracked him. Several passengers held up phones, recording. The atmosphere was loaded. Who called this in? He asked, his voice low as he approached Milo. Milo nodded toward row 12. It's about a seat reassignment. Passenger had a valid ticket. Got pushed to the back by Darren. Passenger's father, he's in row 1, challenged it. Relin turned toward the front. Dr. Jalen Kellis stood with a calm posture, his shoulders square, arms relaxed but commanding. His voice cut across the aisle like a scalpel. I'll speak with you, Jalen said evenly, but only after my son is returned to his assigned seat. Row 12A. Relin, reading the air, gave a single nod. Understood. A ripple of movement. A few heads turned to the rear of the aircraft. Xavian, still seated in 28E, looked up as Milo approached with a quiet nod. He rose slowly, his face flushed but composed. As he made his way up the aisle, scattered applause broke out, light, restrained, but unmistakable. A man in row 10 tapped the armrest twice, a silent signal of support. Another in row 8 gave a thumbs up. The message wasn't loud, but it was clear. Someone noticed. This time, someone stood up. Xavian slid into 12A and fastened his belt. He didn't look around. In the galley, hidden from view, Relin turned his full attention to Darren Mav. The senior flight attendant stood stiffly, arms crossed. His eyes darted briefly to the curtain. Talk to me, Relin began. I want to hear it exactly as it happened. Darren shrugged. Just a balance shift. Needed someone smaller in the back. Relin frowned. And you flagged that where? Because I've got the manifest here, and there's no log. No cabin weight note. No pre-check justification. Darren's stance faltered. He looked down for a beat. Didn't get a chance to log it yet. That's not how this works, Relin said sharply. Not with a seat change. Not with a minor passenger. There was silence for a few seconds. Relin tapped his pen against the clipboard. Then his tone cooled further. This isn't the first time, Darren. We've had grumblings. Nothing formal until now. But this... He looked toward the drawn curtain, where passengers' muffled voices filtered through. This isn't going away quietly. Back in row 1, Jalen sat back in his seat. His eyes scanned the cabin, but his focus sharpened as he felt a presence lean slightly closer from the adjacent row. "Dr. Kellis?" the voice whispered. Jalen turned. A sharply dressed man, perhaps in his 50s, extended a hand. "Darren Bell. I fly this route weekly." Jalen gave a small nod of greeting, cautious. Bell lowered his voice. "He's done this before. Darren. I watched him last month. Black family, young couple with a toddler. Told them their seats were unavailable and pushed them to the back. No announcement. Just ordered them out of the row. No one said a word." Jalen's jaw flexed slightly. "Why didn't you report it?" he asked. Bell looked away for a moment. "Didn't want the confrontation. I told myself it was an error, but it didn't feel like one. And now, watching this play out." He exhaled. "Now I know I should have spoken." Jalen turned forward again, voice quiet but firm. "Then perhaps this flight will be different, because now it's going to be documented properly." Relon Marsh returned to the aisle with the weight of an internal war showing on his face. His jaw was set, but there was a slight drag in his steps, like he already knew this wasn't going to be resolved easily. The hush in the cabin had thickened into a kind of silent reckoning. All eyes were on him now, passengers half-turned in their seats, some phones lowered but still recording, others tucked away in laps, ready to reappear if needed. "Dr. Kellis," Relon began, his voice measured, but edged with corporate polish. "Your son is welcome to remain in seat 12A. We're addressing the staff issue internally. For now, we ask your cooperation so we may take off." Jalen didn't move. He stood tall, posture unwavering, as if the stillness of his body communicated more authority than any raised voice ever could. His fingers rested calmly against the seatback in front of him. He nodded once, slowly, as if considering the words, weighing them not for their surface meaning but for what lay beneath. He finally replied, "We'll cooperate once I see a formal incident report filed, and Darren removed from duty this flight. Otherwise, this plane isn't going anywhere." Gasps rippled through the cabin like the first crackle of a distant storm. The tension had shifted from a passive discomfort into something active, deliberate. The passengers felt it. The crew felt it. And Darren Mav, still stationed near the forward galley, felt it most of all. Darren stepped forward, chin up but voice tight. "You can't make demands," he spat, the corners of his mouth twitching with restrained anger. Jalen turned slowly, his gaze fixed on Darren like a scientist observing a predictable reaction. "I can when discrimination is involved," he said, voice calm but resonant. "And when I know Federal Regulation 73B allows passenger refusal to fly under crew intimidation." A stillness fell again, deeper than before. Even the ambient hum of the aircraft seemed quieter. Relon's expression flickered. His training hadn't prepared him for a passenger who knew the rulebook better than most of his supervisors. He glanced at his tablet, pulled up the manifest again, his thumb pausing at Darren's crew ID. Something changed in his eyes. He turned away and stepped toward the cockpit phone. The entire cabin held its breath. Minutes passed, each second stretching. Jalen remained still, like a sentinel guarding more than just a seat. Xavier watched from 12A, hands gripping the armrests, his heart thudding. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about what that seat represented: place, voice, dignity. Around him, passengers sat frozen, caught between discomfort and rising admiration. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Vern Raddock emerged, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, eyes that didn't blink more than they had to. He didn't say a word at first. He simply stepped forward, reviewed the screen on Relon's tablet, and turned to Darren with the weariness of a man who'd seen enough storms to know when one wasn't worth flying into. "You're being pulled," the captain said flatly. Darren blinked. "What?" "Grab your kit. We'll file formal report post-takeoff." It wasn't up for discussion. Darren's mouth opened, then closed. His face flushed deep red, a mix of fury and humiliation rising to the surface like boiling water under a tight lid. He stood frozen for a second too long, long enough for the moment to imprint itself in every eye that watched. Then he turned, yanked his service bag from the jump seat, and stomped down the aisle. The sound of his footsteps faded behind the sealed aircraft door. The lock clicked. The seal hissed. The silence deepened. Jalen returned to row 12, sitting beside his son in the now-restored seat. Xavier turned to him, his voice low but sharp with awe. "Dad," he whispered, eyes wide. "What just happened?" Jalen placed a hand gently on his shoulder and answered, steady as the sky above them. "Justice boarded the flight today." The flight finally took off 20 minutes behind schedule. The engines roared to life beneath a heavy silence, but it wasn't the usual kind that follows a delay. Something had shifted in the air. The cabin wasn't just settling, it was watching, remembering. Xavier sat upright in 12A, gripping the armrest as the plane lifted into the sky. Though the seat had cushioned beneath him, the tension hadn't left. It sat in his chest, just beneath the heartbeat, pulsing with questions he wasn't ready to voice. Jalen watched his son from row 1, the sightline narrow but unbroken. The movement of the plane did little to distract him. His mind was still navigating a different kind of turbulence. Not from altitude but from history, the kind of pattern he had spent his career exposing, and now had to confront on behalf of his son. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was the line between silence and consequence. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Milo Tren approached slowly, his posture unsure, carrying a plastic cup of water with trembling fingers. "Sir," he said, voice low, "I just want to say I should have said something sooner." He stopped mid-aisle, not sure how close he was allowed to get now. Jalen looked up from his folded hands and met his eyes with a measured calm. "Speaking late is better than never," he replied, his voice steady, firm. "But remember, silence protects the wrong side." Milo exhaled, as if the guilt had been sitting on his chest the entire flight. "I'll remember that," he whispered, before walking away, the click of his shoes swallowed by the cabin's new hush. At cruising altitude, the captain's voice filled the overhead. His words were polished, careful. "We thank you for your patience and understanding today. Our crew remains committed to your safety and comfort." He didn't name names. He didn't mention seats. But it didn't matter. Everyone had seen. Everyone knew. The sound faded, and the murmur resumed, soft but significant. Across the aisle, passengers nodded toward Jalen with quiet reverence. One man in row 5, a silver-haired traveler in a tailored vest, rose and approached him discreetly. Without a word, he extended a business card. Jalen accepted it and read the name, Malron Avery, Civil Rights Counsel. "If you want help filing the report," the man whispered, his voice barely audible beneath the hum of the engines. Jalen gave a single nod and slipped the card into his jacket pocket, saying nothing more. The weight of the moment didn't need a speech. It just needed witnesses. Meanwhile, a few rows back, Xavier felt a gentle tap on his arm. He turned to find a boy about his age, lean, with dark curls tucked under a baseball cap. "Hey!" the boy said, glancing down the aisle to make sure no one was listening. "I saw what they did. That ever happened to you before?" Xavier studied his face, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or deflect. "First time," he said quietly. The boy leaned closer. "It happened to my cousin once. They said it was for security, but they only moved him. Only him." He paused, his voice softer now. "They always find a reason, don't they?" Xavier nodded slowly. "Yeah, but now I know what to do when it's not the last." The boy leaned back, eyes searching Xavier's face for something, strength, maybe, or recognition. He gave a small nod before turning away. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly in all directions, but inside that pressurized cabin, something had grounded itself. A new resolve, a record of courage, however quiet, now in motion. And at the center of it sat a father and a son, separated by seats, but bound by truth. "First time," Xavier had said. "But now I know what to do when it's not the last." Milo approached with the cautious steps of someone about to cross a fragile line. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he glanced around the cabin, checking for eavesdroppers. his eyes scanning over dozing passengers and the hum of meal carts clinking in the background. Then, without preamble, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded slip of paper, and slid it onto Jalen's tray table. "I shouldn't be showing you this," he whispered, voice barely audible above the air conditioning's steady drone. "But you need to see what Darren wrote before boarding." Jalen blinked once, then lowered his gaze to the paper. He unfolded it slowly, methodically, as if it were an artifact pulled from ash, something that might disintegrate if handled too roughly. The form was a standard pre-flight crew preparation sheet, used routinely to jot down passenger notes, gate alerts, or onboard considerations. But this one had a comment line that stopped Jalen cold. "Watch for trouble seats. Row 12, young black male traveling solo. Possible disturbance if needed." The words pulsed on the page like a wound reopened. Jalen stared at it. For a moment he didn't move. Then his hand clenched around the edge of the tray, his knuckles whitening. His mouth tightened, but he forced himself to keep his tone even. "He flagged my son?" he asked, without looking up. "Before Xavier even stepped on board?" The gravity in his voice drew Milo in like a vacuum. Milo shifted uncomfortably, nodding once. "Yes, sir. Without cause. I didn't see anything in the system about your son being a disruption risk. I only saw that note just before takeoff. That's when it hit me." He swallowed hard, guilt evident in the downturn of his shoulders. "He's been doing that. Not just today. Subtle things. Moving certain passengers. Making notes. Never directly stated. But there's a pattern." Jalen's mind raced, the pieces clicking into place like a lock being picked open. It hadn't been a moment of impulse. It wasn't just a bad attitude or a random display of power. This was orchestrated, targeted, preemptive bias. He looked again at the form, his academic brain cataloging everything, the handwriting, the timestamp, the initials in the corner. This wasn't just discrimination. It was policy in action by someone who believed they wouldn't be caught. He looked up slowly. "This," he said, tapping the page, "this turns everything into a federal matter." Milo hesitated. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "But I've watched Darren reroute passengers before. He knows the codes to use. Balance weight. Crew discretion. Possible compliance issue. It always looks innocent on paper, but it isn't. Not when you see who it keeps happening to." Jalen leaned back slightly in his seat, the document still open in front of him. Around them, the plane was still, cruising above the clouds, silent and indifferent. He felt the hum of the engines in his chest, but now it vibrated like a warning. His son, seated just rows away, had been marked, flagged for possible disturbance, not because of behavior, but because of identity. The bile rose in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "We need to preserve this exactly as it is," Jalen said. "Chain of custody, no tampering. If it's going to stand up in front of oversight, it has to be clean." Milo nodded quickly. "I have an incident pouch. I'll seal it now." He reached for his side compartment, pulled out the airline-issued tamper-proof envelope, and carefully inserted the form. The adhesive strip was activated, and once pressed shut, it would be time-stamped by barcode on landing. Jalen watched the process with the eye of someone who had done this before in a different arena, testifying in ethics hearings, preparing students for conflict deconstruction, training systems to detect bias. But this time it wasn't theoretical. It was his son. "Did anyone else see it?" Jalen asked quietly.
"No."
"Darren keeps things close. But I've copied some logs before. Passenger shifts. They never line up with seating weight distributions. I didn't know what I was looking at until now." A faint tremor ran through the cabin as the plane passed through a thin cloud layer, a light bump that startled no one, but it mirrored the churn rising in Jalen's chest. He looked forward, then backward. His mind was already jumping ahead, next steps, report protocols, press pressure points, internal codes. But most of all, it burned with one central conviction. This was going further than a complaint. This was systemic. And now it was going public. He looked at Milo again. The young man was sweating slightly at the temple, fear and courage dueling beneath his skin. "You did the right thing," Jalen said softly. "And now you're part of the record." Milo exhaled, nodding. "I won't back out. Whatever you need, I'll stand behind it." Jalen reached for the pouch, touched the edge. The seal was firm, unbreakable unless intentionally torn. Proof, not just of what had happened, but of what had always been happening in silence. He turned toward the window, staring out into the endless blue horizon. Then he whispered, almost to himself, but just loud enough for Milo to hear, "They thought we'd just sit down and forget. Not this time." He smirked, confident the teen would comply, unaware that every eye in the cabin was about to witness the real authority rise. If you believe arrogance under a uniform always collapses when faced with courage, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The wheels struck the runway with a jolt, the fuselage vibrating lightly as Airway Flight 228 made contact with the tarmac. In the seconds that followed, the usual soft rustle of passengers reaching for seatbelts or glancing toward the windows was broken by something else, a ripple of expectation. Captain Vern Raddock's voice rose over the intercom, calm but unusual. "Per protocol, authorities will meet us at the gate for a crew review. Please remain seated. We appreciate your cooperation." Jalen Kellis didn't move. His eyes, sharpened by years of parsing unspoken signals in human behavior, narrowed slightly as he tapped his encrypted tablet awake. Fingers moving fast, he compiled timestamps. Xavier's message, Darren's order, the confrontation, Milo's admission, and now this announcement. Each line in the digital log pulsed with weight. He labeled them precisely: date, time, name, violation. The foundation of a case was forming, and he knew momentum was critical. A row behind him, Xavier leaned into the aisle, his voice barely above the hum of the cabin. "You really think they'll listen?" he asked, his tone not cynical, but quietly worn by disbelief. Jalen met his son's gaze, pausing only long enough to weigh the question not as a father, but as a man who had watched too many doors quietly close on truth. "They might not," he said after a breath, "but they'll have to respond." Across the cabin, Flight Attendant Milo Tren emerged, posture rigid but face flushed with something more than nerves, resolve. He approached slowly, reaching into his side pocket. "Dr. Kellis?" he said, voice hushed as he crouched slightly to avoid drawing attention. "I've decided I'll testify if it comes to that. Darren's been protected for too long." His hand trembled slightly as he extended a folded slip of paper, tucked now inside a tamper-proof incident pouch. Jalen didn't touch it yet. Instead, he studied Milo's face. The fear there wasn't just for his job, it was the fear of shifting loyalty from silence to truth. "Then you're part of the change now," Jalen said, his voice soft but unwavering. He took the pouch, slid it into his carry-on, and nodded once. A moment passed. The air in the cabin had a quiet charge to it. Even passengers who hadn't spoken since takeoff seemed to lean slightly in the direction of row one. As the aircraft taxied, the light above the cockpit door clicked off. From the front jump seat, Crew Supervisor Relin Marsh rose and made his way down the narrow aisle. He moved with the calculated efficiency of someone caught between policy and pressure. He stopped beside Jalen, nodding with forced professionalism. In his hand was a sealed envelope, embossed with Airway's legal watermark. "Temporary incident report copy," Relin murmured, "and a note from legal. They're requesting a formal conversation upon landing." Jalen took the envelope and tucked it beneath his tablet without breaking eye contact. "I appreciate the follow-through," he said, though his tone suggested he would verify every line of that report himself. Around them, passengers remained seated, most unusually quiet, all alert. The buzz wasn't just from the announcement. It was from something they'd seen unfold in real time. Not an outburst, not a scandal, but a man calmly insisting that silence not be mistaken for acceptance. Xavier watched his father fold the envelope carefully. His chest swelled slightly, not just with pride, but with a dawning understanding of what had just happened, what it meant to be seen, and what it cost to stay seated when someone tried to erase you. Jalen glanced at him again, expression unreadable but anchored in a deeper purpose. We don't go silent when it's convenient, he said softly, voice steady above the low rumble of the taxiing plane. We speak because others can't. The glass door hissed shut behind them as Jalen stepped onto the jet bridge, flanked by Relin Marsh and Milo Tren. Two uniformed compliance officers in blue vests waited just outside the aircraft threshold, their stances alert but not aggressive. One of them, Officer Bram Kelvin, lifted his badge slightly. Dr. Kellis? We're here to document the crew incident and begin an initial compliance review. Jalen gave a curt nod. Behind him, passengers disembarked slowly, their expressions solemn. A few murmured thanks, others offered respectful nods. Then an older white man, leaning on a cane, paused in front of Jalen and grasped his hand firmly. His voice was low, but filled with something heavier than words. I wish someone like you stood up when my grandson got profiled last summer. He still doesn't fly anymore. Jalen met his eyes, the corners of his mouth tightening with both sadness and resolve. I'm sorry he went through that, he said softly. He shouldn't have had to. The man's grip lingered, then let go. He stepped past into the terminal without another word. Inside the small glass-walled holding room reserved for post-incident reviews, the lighting was sharp and sterile. The hum of the HVAC filled the silence between words. One officer began the recording protocol while the other laid out a blank incident chart. Relin sat near the edge of the table, silent, his body rigid. Milo shifted nervously beside him, pulling out a printed copy of the pre-boarding log, the one with Darren's damning notation. Row 12, young black male, traveling solo. Possible disturbance if needed. Jalen began methodically, tone professional but precise. We're here today because my son was forcibly reassigned from seat 12A, his confirmed, ticketed seat, to the back of the aircraft without cause. The attending crew member, Darren Mav, failed to scan or log this change in the manifest. He made the call based on an undocumented claim of balance. That explanation unraveled when other seating data proved it was unnecessary. Officer Kelvin took notes rapidly. And this was challenged mid-flight? Jalen nodded. Publicly, I asked for the change to be reviewed. Darren backed down. Later, Milo here provided evidence that my son had been flagged before boarding. That's the key. Milo leaned forward, sliding the log across the table. His voice trembled slightly. This note wasn't just arbitrary. He'd been making these kinds of calls for months. Sometimes it was black passengers. Sometimes Latino. Always people traveling alone. He called it seat streamlining when questioned, but I've seen how it works. The second officer, Warren Trask, stiffened. Are you suggesting a pattern of racial targeting during seat assignments? I'm not suggesting, Jalen said. I'm stating. And I believe your internal records will support it. Especially given what Mr. Theron Bell told me. Who's that? Officer Trask asked. A frequent flyer. He said he witnessed a similar switch last month involving a black family. Moved with no explanation. No safety reason. No apology. The room fell into a heavy silence. Kelvin glanced at Relin, who had remained silent thus far. And you, sir? As head supervisor, were you aware of this behavior prior to today? Relin's jaw tightened. He exhaled through his nose before answering. I'd heard whispers, but no one brought me direct proof. And I didn't think Darren would ever be so bold during a full flight. That's on me. I own that. Kelvin tapped his pen. He's had previous complaints, Dr. Kellis? 3. All archived quietly, but they're in your system. Seat reassignments, profiling language, coded notes in crew logs. He's operated unchecked. Trask stepped out to confirm the file history. When he returned, he looked visibly disturbed. Confirmed. Mav has 3 documented passenger complaints in the last 8 months. 2 involved reassignments. 1 involved a denied upgrade request from a Hispanic teen traveling alone, despite open seats. Kelvin's hand hovered over the red folder. Dr. Kellis, based on your statement and corroborating evidence, this incident qualifies as a Class C inquiry. We'll escalate to corporate compliance, and Darren Mav will be formally removed from active rotation pending hearing. Good, Jalen said, his voice calm but icy. But understand this, if the system permits him to fly again without full investigation, it's not just him that failed. It's the system itself. Through the windowed partition, Xavier sat quietly in the hallway, swinging his legs slowly, unaware that his presence alone was altering the air inside the room. He watched his father speak with resolve, backed by facts and calm authority. To Xavier, this wasn't just his dad now. It was someone leading something bigger than a personal defense. It was a stand for dignity that stretched far beyond row 12. Jalen signed the officer's summary form and tucked away a copy into his leather folder. He opened the glass door, stepped into the corridor, and offered his hand to his son. "Let's go home, Zay," he said, eyes steady. Then his voice dropped, the final line anchored with quiet fire. But not quietly. The cursor blinked on a blank document as Jalen Kellis sat upright at his desk in Norwin City, the glare of the screen reflecting the quiet storm building behind his eyes. His fingers hovered, then moved decisively, naming names, citing timestamps, linking behaviors to federal regulations. The complaint he filed with the Passenger Civil Protections Office was not emotional. It was precise. Facts were his shield, clarity his sword. The seat reassignment, the pre-boarding notes, Milo's corroboration, the silence of others. He layered them like bricks in a wall that would not crumble. Next came the letter, addressed directly to Arave's corporate board. It was measured in tone but firm in demand. He requested transparency. He demanded accountability. He offered timelines, logs, and proof. The response came 2 days later, a shallow apology filled with rehearsed phrases. Internal audit, isolated incident, our commitment to diversity. It read like a script. Jalen read it once, then twice, then closed the message with a quiet breath through his nose. He had studied these tactics for years. Now he was living inside them. So he opened a different window, a blank post. He uploaded Milo's signed statement, attached the clearest passenger-filmed video of Darren's order to shift for balance. Then, with care, Jalen wrote a letter not to the boardroom but to the public. "Dear fellow travelers," it began, "this is about more than a seat." The words poured out, not as an outburst, but as a revelation. He explained Xavier's reassignment, the silent compliance of passengers, the crew's casual targeting, the paper Darren had left behind, the system that let it happen again. "My son was told to move. He did. But now we're moving something else." He clicked, publish. The post spread like fire through dry grass. Within 2 hours, the hashtag #Row12Truth began appearing across platforms. By midnight, it was trending in multiple cities. The comments poured in hundreds, then thousands. Some shared identical stories. Seat changes justified by balance. Teens reassigned when flying alone. Families split without warning. Others expressed rage, grief, and solidarity. "This happened to my nephew," one man wrote. "And we said nothing. Never again." The next morning, Jalen received an email marked urgent from Sky Signal News. Senior correspondent Darren Cross requested an interview. "Your voice matters," the message read. "We want your side of this, unedited." Jalen agreed on one condition. "My son speaks too," he said over the phone, calm and unwavering. "If he's old enough to be profiled, he's old enough to speak." The producer hesitated, then agreed. The next evening, the lights clicked on in a modest studio 2 blocks from their home. Xavier sat beside his father, shoulders tense at first. The room smelled of warm wires and plastic coffee lids. The camera operator gave a thumbs up. Darren leaned forward and asked, "Xavier, can you tell us what happened on that flight?" Xavier took a breath, then looked straight into the lens. "I didn't expect my first solo flight to become a fight," he said, his voice steady. "But my dad taught me not to stay silent." The room froze for a beat. Even the cameraman seemed to pause. The interview aired that same night in a prime slot. By morning, Arave's PR department had gone into full damage control. Social media pages were flooded with calls for answers. Shareholders began calling emergency sessions. A closed-door board meeting was announced within 48 hours. Jalen knew what that meant. Not justice yet, but fear. He stood by the window of their apartment, phone in hand, watching the streetlights flicker. Xavier was asleep in the other room, the glow of the television reflecting a paused frame of their interview. Jalen turned and whispered to himself with quiet certainty. Now, they're hearing us at 30,000 feet. The cameras clicked in rapid flashes as Arrive's CEO, Darla Vox, stepped up to the podium. The Monday air was tense. Crisp suits, folded arms, and media passes lined the press room at the airline's downtown headquarters. Vox's voice was smooth, measured, but lacked conviction. "We have suspended crew member Darren Mav pending further internal review," he began. "Additionally, Arrive will be implementing revised training modules for in-flight staff to ensure greater sensitivity and professionalism." Behind the polished corporate language, Jalen Kellis sat quietly in his Norwin home office, watching the broadcast on a muted screen. He didn't flinch. He didn't even frown. His fingers remained laced together, elbows resting on the edge of his desk. The room around him was still, except for the blinking cursor on the corner of a document titled Clear Seat Initiative Draft 1. Hours later, seated across from a local journalist, Jalen's tone was firm but calm. "Bias doesn't get erased by a slideshow," he said plainly. "It's erased by structural accountability. By name. By paper trail." The interviewer leaned forward, sensing something deeper beneath the surface. Jalen reached into a leather folder and laid down a manifesto. A comprehensive proposal drafted alongside legal advisors, former aviation workers, and compliance officers. "The Clear Seat Initiative isn't just a policy push," he continued. "It's a mechanism to make silent seat reassignments visible, traceable, and challengeable." The document outlined 3 demands: enforceable transparency in seating algorithms, accessible passenger alerts for reassignment explanations, and a federal audit protocol for flagged profiles. Within days, civil rights groups backed it. Letters of support arrived from universities, legal centers, and retired aviation experts who'd seen too many quiet removals. But while the headlines circulated, Xavier was back in school, navigating a different kind of turbulence. The story had followed him there. Some classmates gave him quiet nods in the hall. Others stared. One boy muttered, "You got famous for sitting in a chair?" Xavier ignored him, but the words stung. He ate lunch at the edge of the cafeteria now, headphones in, staring at half-eaten food. One afternoon, a teacher named Mr. Rowan quietly sat beside him with a tray. His tone was gentle, his hands slightly shaking as he unfolded a napkin. "My son's adopted," he said softly. "I showed him your video last night. He's 10. I've never seen him sit that still. You gave him something I couldn't. Hope." Xavier's throat tightened. He nodded once, then looked down at the plastic tray in front of him. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he said, barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to sit where I belonged." That evening, Jalen received an encrypted message from a compliance attorney who had reviewed the Clear Seat white paper. "This is bigger than Arrive," it read. "What you're suggesting could reform the entire domestic airline system." But Jalen wasn't interested in glory. In his study, surrounded by pinned news clippings and legal folders, he stared at the corkboard lined with photos, one of Xavier, smiling awkwardly in the row 12 seat. One of the seat map Milo had discreetly shared. Another of the folded crew flag form with young black male, scrawled in blue ink. He knew the story wasn't over. Not even close. But that line, Xavier's line, stayed with him the most. And when the next press request came in, Jalen only had one condition. "If he's old enough to be profiled," he told the journalist, "he's old enough to speak." And when that moment came, under soft studio lights, the air crisp and the camera red, Xavier sat beside his father and spoke clearly. "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just trying to sit where I belonged." The hearing room was packed. Cameras blinked quietly in the back. Congressional aides lined the walls, scribbling notes. Reporters hunched over their tablets. And at the center of it all sat Dr. Jalen Kellis, straight-backed, crisp dark blazer, a calm that seemed carved from stone. But beneath that calm, something far more volatile stirred: purpose. He didn't blink as the chairman adjusted the mic. "Dr. Kellis, you may begin your statement." Jalen stood slowly. "Thank you, Chairman Mervis. I am here today not just as a father, but as a witness to a quiet pattern that spans beyond my son's seat on Aireve Flight 228. He paused. "What happened to my son Xavier was not random. It was designed to feel that way. It was subtle, disposable. It was meant to vanish as soon as the wheels lifted off the tarmac." He reached into a folder and placed a clear evidence sleeve on the panel's desk. "This is the crew document that flagged my son, age 16, black, traveling alone, as a possible disturbance. Before he even stepped on board." Gasps rippled from behind the bench. The senators leaned forward. One furrowed his brow as the words came into focus on the printout. "That note was made by a flight attendant who had a documented history of seat reassignments tied to race and age," Jalen continued. "Yet he flew unchecked, shielded by silence and loopholes." He turned, gesturing to the gallery. "My son is seated behind me. He was moved to the back of the plane, despite a valid, confirmed ticket, without cause, without explanation, and with the expectation that no one would notice, that he wouldn't question it, that I wouldn't either." Jalen's voice was steady, but every syllable carried weight, forged from the sleepless nights that had followed the incident, the endless policy reading, the interviews, the statements, the pressure. "And for a while," he added, "they were right. How many others never got moved back to their rightful seat? How many stories went unwitnessed, unspoken?" Xavier looked up from the gallery. His fingers were clenched in his lap, eyes wide, not just because the words belonged to his father, but because they now belonged to something larger. Jalen's testimony lasted 12 minutes. By the time he sat down, the room had changed. No one was typing. No one was whispering. A story that had started in seat 12A was now echoing through the highest chambers of accountability. And the ripple widened. Days later, Milo Tren, now reassigned to Airve's operations desk, emailed Jalen in the early hours of a Friday morning. "I've made my decision," the note read. Attached was a compressed file, time logs, crew notes, and behavior patterns from the last 6 months, each one outlining similar reassignments based on passenger age, ethnicity, or perceived roastability. None of it had been officially filed. All of it had been used. Jalen stared at the screen, heart thudding. This was the proof they hadn't dared hope for. Not just Darren Mav's actions, but a systemic quiet algorithm of profiling, woven into crew discretion, left unexamined for too long. That same day, a whistleblower coalition formed. Former Airve attendants came forward, 6 in total. All male, all with similar experiences. One revealed a document titled Passenger Discretion Guidelines, unofficially circulated during onboarding. It didn't use the word profile. It used words like sensitivity, visual cues, and preventive placement. Another shared voice memos from crew lounges. Phrases like, "Row 12 looks rowdy," and "push them back before the parents notice." Jokes disguised as strategy. Jalen assembled the data. He presented it to the Passenger Civil Protections Office. Legal teams from 3 civil rights organizations joined him in drafting a formal proposal for legislative oversight. Then the final shift happened. Congressional aides contacted Jalen's office. A new bill was forming. Draft name, Passenger Dignity Enforcement Act. The working nickname, Row 12 Reform. Its provisions were detailed. Airlines would be required to log all mid-flight or pre-board seat changes, including crew explanations. Passengers could request a formal review post-flight if reassigned without consent. Airlines failing to provide documentation would face Class B citations and DOT penalties. Jalen sat with Xavier in their home office that night, going over the bill's draft language. "They're even naming a clause after the clear seat model," he muttered, surprised. Xavier looked at the line of legal text on the screen. "The Clear Seat Passenger Rights Clause. That's Kinda wild. Jalen leaned back, tired but firm. It's happening because you didn't stay quiet. Xavier exhaled. Did we actually start something? Jalen turned, a small, quiet smile on his lips.
No.
You did. A year had passed, but the air still held the weight of memory as Xavier Kellis stepped onto the polished tile floor of Velmer International. The automatic doors parted behind him, and he followed his father toward Gate B7, quietly, deliberately, until they stopped before a modest brass plaque embedded into the wall near the seating area. It was unguarded.
No ceremony.
No crowd. Just a quiet piece of metal with etched words that shimmered beneath the terminal lights, dedicated to every traveler who chose not to stay silent. Beneath it, in block letters, Row 12 Truth, March 17, 2025. Xavier stood still, his breath catching in his chest. His reflection in the polished surface stared back at him. Older now, taller, shoulders set differently than a year ago. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, but his eyes stayed fixed on the plaque. He didn't speak. Neither did his father, Dr. Jalen Kellis, who stood just beside him, hands clasped behind his back, face unreadable. Then Jalen stepped forward and ran a hand across the edge of the metal. His fingers moved slowly, as if confirming it was real, as if grounding himself in what had changed and what hadn't. Across the terminal, digital boards flicked with flight numbers. Travelers bustled past without noticing the plaque, or the pair standing before it. But to Xavier, everything else had gone silent. Still remember that day? Jalen asked quietly, not looking away from the inscription. I remember thinking it was just a seat, Xavier replied, voice low. But it wasn't. Jalen turned to him, and for a moment, the boy he had protected looked more like a young man. The same determination, but now steadier. Wiser. Seats tell stories, Jalen said. Especially the ones they try to take. Their flight wasn't for another hour, but they'd arrived early by choice. Not to relive the pain, but to witness the change. Airave Airlines had eventually implemented a new series of reforms. Real-time seat reassignment alerts, a transparent record of crew-initiated changes, and internal audits shared with third-party civil rights monitors. Other airlines followed. Not all enthusiastically. Some dragged their feet. But change, like turbulence, didn't ask for comfort before arriving. And today, Milo Tren, the once junior attendant who had handed Jalen the folded warning note, served on the Passenger Protection Oversight Board. He was the youngest member ever appointed. He'd sent them both a message that morning. Thanks for making space for truth. They don't always leave room for it on planes. Jalen's phone buzzed softly with that reminder. He slipped it back into his coat without comment. In the months after the incident, Jalen had turned down several national awards, citing a desire to keep the focus on the issue, not the individual. But he had accepted one honor, a Youth Integrity Award on Xavier's behalf. That evening, on a dimly lit stage in a high school auditorium, he had stood before rows of students and whispered into the microphone. The courage to speak doesn't start with a podium. Sometimes it starts in a seat someone tried to take from you. That quote now lived on social media walls, posters in classrooms, and one teacher's bumper sticker. As they moved from the plaque toward the boarding area, Xavier carried that memory. There were no news crews waiting now. Just the hum of wheels on tile, the quiet beep of gate announcements, and the whisper of families gathering near the windows. Their tickets, Row 1 and Row 2, had been booked intentionally. Not to prove anything, not out of fear, but to reclaim space, fully unapologetically. As they neared the gate, Xavier slowed his steps. Dad! Jalen looked at him. Xavier gestured faintly toward the crowd of travelers forming nearby, diverse, distracted, unaware. Do you think people remember what happened here? Jalen met his son's gaze, his eyes steady, voice calm. They remember because you never moved. He forced the teen to move, and froze as the father stood, calm and commanding, every passenger watching him reclaim dignity. If you believe true power speaks without shouting, subscribe now, because justice always lands where it's meant to. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, abuse of authority, and the moment accountability confronts prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and treating every passenger with dignity and respect.